and its institutions is absolutely critical to our understanding of that moment. So today we have asked our panelists to reflect on the role and relevance of democratic institutions in the past and present in light of their respective expertise, and that is related to the United States and beyond. We're going to address a range of topics from what institutions are most relevant to the sustenance of a democratic form of government, what makes them hold or break, what kinds of pressures they endure, and which role knowledge production in general and historical education in particular play in shaping those institutions. I'm delighted to be joined by our 4 panelists today, including Debarati Bagchi, a historian of education in India based in New Delhi, Martina Kessel, a historian of gender, states, and violence in modernity based in Bielefeld, Adam Knowles, who is a specialist on Nazism and the role of universities and is based in Zurich, and Kenneth Ledford, historian of modern Germany, who works primarily upon processes of class formation and who is based in Cleveland, Ohio. So we're going to dive right in, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide a 5-minute or so perspective on this topic for us. And we want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and conversations with all of our attendees. So I am going to turn the floor over to Debarati. Oh, and you are on mute.
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Christina, for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited to be a part of it. So I'll try my best to stick to the 5-minute time and yet say a few things that might be important to encourage a conversation with the panelists and the audience. So since I am from India, and I will speak from my context, and since today's topic is on not just on democracy, but democratic institutions as well. So let me just begin by saying that in India, we know that there's a long history of the colonial education system, how it has lingered in some areas, how it has been transformed in the post-colonial period in some areas. So if we come to the question of institution of, I will talk about education today from the perspective of democracy and institutionalization. And if we talk about institutionalization in terms of the introduction of school systems, higher education systems, universities, then I think the question of access, the question of free and compulsory access to education had its germination in the colonial period itself. And it had been discussed, and the discourse went through various shifts, right, from the early colonial period. And it can be said that right from 1920s, there was a certain push, like from when the Indians started to participate in the act of governance more and more, there was a certain push towards free and compulsory education rights in India. But we can also see that it was in a scattered way in various regions that it was introduced, and not universally till then. And it was actually not even immediately after independence, but in 2009 that the first free and compulsory universal act came, where children would have the right to have elementary education till classes 8, till the age of 14. For public universities, the history went on very differently. There were some very few universities that started being established from 1857. 1904, the government concentrated a little more both resource and attention to the system of universities. We know that public universities in India have been seen as a major space for encouraging democratic and inclusive thoughts. And which is also probably why today there is a huge attack on public universities as well, particularly over the last decade. And so in terms of access, I want to go back to the first point. In terms of access, institutionalization, through institutionalization, it has been attempted to give greater access to more and more people, to include the masses, greater participation. But historians and sociologists of education have shown that access did not always ensure that the inherent inequalities, the structural problems went away. They were almost in maybe in newer forms. These institutions often sustained and even reproduced social injustices, social inequalities.
It looks like Joshua.
Which is
Debarati, you have accidentally muted yourself, or someone muted you. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
Webinar trouble.
I think, education itself shown that inequalities have been reproduced in new ways. And there have been a deepening of that since the liberalization of the economy in 91 and the increasing privatization of higher education. And right now we are seeing a rampant privatization of universities in India, which is a completely different story altogether, and a systematic attack on public universities and an attempt to destroy the whatever democratic values they wanted to perpetrate. Just moving on to the next point, I would like to say that when I say that the present right-wing majoritarian regime is trying to destroy certain institutions and the very social cultural fabric of diversity, that is a precondition of the formation and sustenance of democratic ideals in India. It is also to be kept in mind that there is a fear that what they want to do is manufacture and celebrate a homogeneous, singular idea of an Indian past, which is a Hindu past, and it has to be very singular and homogeneous, which is why the discipline of history has become such a target of attack. And historians are living under extreme concern, worry, and anxiety in India. And they are every day facing different kinds of and forms of violence on the discipline, the perpetration of in social media, different kinds of distorted versions of history, different kinds of narratives, and basically curriculum, textbooks, historical knowledge at large had become a political battleground. I would like to say that beyond institutionalization, what should be taught, as Michael Apple has said, what should be taught has always been not only an educational issue, but always an inherently ideological and political issue. And at that point of what should be taught, the fight over democracy is happening between the ruling regime and the other side, which tries to uphold the secular democratic ideals. I would end by saying that we as historians have been thinking of ways to deal with this situation. Since this panel from its very first day has also been discussing about ways to engaging with the situation, I just try to say that many professional historians are now trying to address the question that are we really living in our respective bubbles? Have we really lost touch with the so-called public? And which has now incited the debate between the public and the professional. It has brought that debate in the foreground, in the question of institutionalization and democratization of education. So with that, I would end, and we can carry on the discussion over the similar threads when others speak.
Thank you so much. We'll turn now to hear from Martina.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Good, thanks.
I'd like to make 3 points in all brevity as a historian of modern Germany. And my main argument actually is that it does not suffice to look at institutions alone, but to realize that constructions of identity are crucial to the ways of how contemporaries in the past and the present assessed and used democratic institutions. So my first point, to my mind, democratic institutions since their inception in the late 18th century were constitutively based upon inclusion and exclusion, organized along essentialized notions of identity. As example, I quote Tyler Stovall in his book White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea from 2021, and freedom is an idea, not an institution, but a key idea to organize institutions in democratic fashion. And he argued that we should stop understanding modern democracy as the paradox of first having invented the idea of freedom and then withholding it from Black people and people of color. Instead, we should realize that there never was a paradox to begin with, because the very idea of freedom had been defined as white. I would extend that argument. The identity that should organize the world since the late 18th century was essentialized in the modern West as white, Western, masculine, and in Germany also as Christian, positing that Jews and Muslims were inherently different from Germans. And these notions were then used to define the institutions of citizenship, for example, of suffrage, but also universities, but as well to identify those key terms that organize those institutions, for example, the very term of knowledge production, which was defined as white, Western, masculine, etc. And so my second point, I would say that such essentialist notions of identity have never disappeared completely, but could be reactivated in certain moments of time. And so during the 19th and 20th century, two processes were intertwined. On the one hand, the idea of democratic equality in all institutions was in the world, so the excluded or marginalized could refer to it, and democratic institutions were increasingly democratized over time. On the other hand, though, this was not simply a slow but steady process of democratization. Instead, I would argue, at least in Germany, that in each historical moment when a group successfully reached formal equality in institutional terms, those who did not like that created new practices to keep hierarchy, if less formalized, and they often did so by drawing on essentialist notions of identity. So the history of Jewish Germans in the 19th and early 20th century reflected these entangled processes. Whenever Jewish Germans reached further equality, and definitely when the Weimar Republic as a democratic system simply accepted or allowed access to all institutions defined as democratic, the majority of non-Jewish Jewish Germans insisted ever more violently on an essentialist difference between Germans and Jews, which they could never prove, but used as criteria who may belong and who might have what access to which institution. And so I see practices like these rising again. And so my third point takes us into the present. Since the later 20th century, democratic societies like the US or Germany have both intensified their efforts to democratize institutions and have shifted their focus somewhat. So first, they try to democratize institutions further, for example, by practices like affirmative action to allow more diverse access to universities, for example. But also, I think, very tentatively, at least more people than before started to question the essentialist character of identity. And so more people started to question, for example, the binary construction of gender as a natural phenomenon. And when the state threw its power behind that, more countries than before allowed their citizens to self-define in non-binary forms, at least regarding gender. And the universities are one side where that has been discussed most intently, and democratic courts have been another institution that have helped this process along. And I think this is sort of this questioning of the essentialist character of identity, which could translate into institutions, has been one of the starting points of non-democratic actors at the moment. And I think analogous to non-democrats in the Weimar Republic, they again today shift politics away from policy issues that can and need to be negotiated with arguments and shift politics to the level of identity politics that they present as natural and not needing any arguments. And on this basis, they attack democratic institutions that allow diversity to democratize themselves as destroying the allegedly natural foundation of the world. And to wrap this up, I think that these politics are neither erratic nor irrational, as some of my colleagues say, because I think it's a cultural logic in moving politics to identity politics that serves at least two aims, next to not having to argue. It allows to create an allegedly more coherent way of making sense of the world, also regarding our past. I found that point very interesting in our presentation just now. But it also allows effectively to gain a greater constituency for non-democratic politics, it seems. If non-democrats focused on concrete policy issues, they might be confronted much more quickly by conflicting interests. But focusing on allegedly natural identities, which they then use to organize migration or the access to universities, I think many more people throughout society might go along who otherwise might define as Democrats. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Adam, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you to the fellow panelists and thank you to the organizers as well. So the institution I'm going to talk about is the university, with just 3 brief glances at contemporary United States, Germany in the Nazi period, and contemporary India as well. So I'll begin. The comparisons with the fall of Weimar Germany and the Trump era, now in its second iteration, have always been uneasy. The question for me since 2016 has been, what is the starting point for such a comparison between the US and Weimar? The question is even more difficult when it comes to universities. Knowledge production in 1933 Germany existed within a much different power nexus than in the US in 2025. All of the German universities nazified in 1933 were fully public institutions with negligible tuition costs. They were without a doubt male-dominated strongholds of cultural elites, yet the particular pressures of the neoliberal university of the present were foreign to them. Comparing early Nazi Germany with neoliberal regimes of the present is difficult, yet we can read them alongside one another. So I'll begin to do that. Firstly, I take it as axiomatic that the modern nation state requires the university as a site of knowledge production. Secondly, for me, what's important isn't just the headline-making attacks on places like Harvard, Columbia, Yale, or Penn. In a country with approximately 4,000 accredited colleges and universities, regional schools, state schools, and community colleges carry out the lion's share of higher education in the United States. These very schools have been under attack by state legislators for decades, and the recent waves of anti-CRT, critical race theory, anti-trans legislation are merely the accelerations of those attacks. So Martina just gave us some wonderful background to that. The sociologist Melinda Cooper tells a portion of this long history in her 2017 book, Family Values. Faced with student protests in the 1960s against the Vietnam War, the burgeoning neoliberal counter-revolution under the then governor of California, Ronald Reagan, recognized a distinct problem, namely, state universities, which in California at the time were virtually tuition-free, seemed to be serving as sites of political, personal, and sexual transformation. The neoliberal technocrats and think tanks supporting Reagan were faced with a dilemma: how to undermine the emancipatory aspect of universities without simultaneously undermining their academic quality. The answer was astoundingly simple: increase the costs of universities and introduce federally backed loans to place the risk solely on the borrower, never on the lender. By tying students to the familial home, the heteronormative family unit could be used as both the driving force of conservatism and as a neoliberal guarantor for the cost of education. Simultaneously, the burdens of cost motivated students to pursue the study of useful, in quotes, useful knowledge. This is a simplified version, of course, of a complex story, but it helps us understand the university, American University 2025. I now shift geographically. I don't want to repeat anything Debarati just wonderfully said, but since coming to power in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his BJP party have pursued a brutal strategy of achieving cultural hegemony by targeting once very illustrious and highly affordable public university system with a robust quota system to guarantee diversity. Simultaneously, a cluster of elite brand name private universities have emerged in India quite rapidly, with prices out of reach for even middle-class Indians. Ashoka, Jindal are two of the most important. Crucially, these private universities are not obligated to enact affirmative action policies. With public universities under assault across the country, these private universities have become a dubious and brittle safe haven for high-quality research and something which we might liken to academic freedom. This brings me to Nazi Germany, the object of my research, where the political forces affecting universities are often misunderstood. Let me offer a few observations about the Nazification of German universities, which can be read alongside our current institutional present. Firstly, the faculty purges, which began in 1933, were swift and brutal, with estimates ranging between 3,000 and 6,000 primarily Jewish faculty purged by 1938. Secondly, Nazification was indeed driven by law changes from above, but perhaps more important were the entrepreneurial, creative forces emerging from below at the university level. These academic entrepreneurs were not opportunists, they were dedicated proponents of the Nazi racial cause. Thirdly, the research shows us clearly that the humanities, German history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, were a driving force behind the Nazification of universities. These disciplines Nazified the curriculum and faculty out of conviction in many cases, and provided the regime valuable ideological support. Fourthly, and lastly, the most troubling moment of universities under National Socialism for me was after approximately 1936. The political pressure on universities caused a swift decline in the quality of German universities. By 1936, there was a lot of internal rumbling about the damage they had done, and there was a sort of return to a certain form of academic freedom. After 1936, Ministry of Education and Culture began to recognize that a higher degree of autonomy at the university level helped to create both a better university and, crucially, a better fascist university. Right? That observation is intended to evoke a sense of dis-ease. I hesitate to end on that sense of dis-ease, but I don't know where else to end at this moment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adam. We'll now turn to Ken.
Well, thank you. And when Christina asked me to join this panel, she proposed what I've called, given the title to my talk, which is Courts, a Peculiar Kind of Democratic Institution. And although I'm an historian of Germany, I'm also a professor of law in an American university, so I'm going to talk primarily from the American perspective here. Last Thursday, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Historical Association, and the Modern Language Association sued the National Endowment of the Humanities for cutting off federal research grants to those associations and to their scholar members. The complaint seeks a declaratory judgment that the reorganization of the NEH, the firing of many of its employees, and the cutoff of already awarded grants from funds appropriated by Congress are all illegal, outside the authority of the managers of the NEH, in legal terms, ultra vires. The litigants also seek prohibitory and mandatory injunctions requiring the NEH to stop reorganizing, firing, and defunding. The plaintiffs cast courts as institutions whose role is to protect democracy from the overreach of administrative and executive power that would harm individuals and associations, and thus democracy. American liberals tell themselves a heroic story, usually cast in terms of the Warren Court, as a defender and expander of democratic rights and civil liberties when legislative gridlock and executive temerity failed to expand the boundaries of democracy. Legal historians, however, have long rejected this view and cautioned champions of democracy to seek protection in 21st century politics rather than in interpretation of an 18th century constitution, seeing courts as too often undemocratic or even anti-democratic institutions. Together with these historians, I want to suggest 3 reasons why we should be modest in our expectations that courts alone will be the democratic institutions in the face of fascist or authoritarian challenge. The first reason is that courts, in cases both of public and private law, reflect the liberal commitment to process over substance, procedural rather than substantive law. The very case filed Thursday relies primarily on the 1946 Administrative Procedure Act, which governs administrative rulemaking by federal agencies. The APA is about the process of making administrative law, and the current actions of the Trump regime are not following it. But court intervention to vindicate the APA will only provide short-term protection against reorganizing, firing, and defunding, while the administration simply goes through the procedural steps of the APA to promulgate a newer, harsher administrative rule that will apply from that point onward. A procedural decision does not settle the underlying issue, which is a substantive dispute of whether authority exists to take the action being challenged. The second reason to be wary of reliance on courts is because courts lack power to enforce their judgments and pronouncements. That power resides in all except the rarest cases in the executive branch. Federal courts in the United States have created doctrines that effectively engage in anticipatory obedience to lawless executive actions. Doctrines such as the political question doctrine, national security authority, and excessive deference to congressional legislation that delegates emergency powers to the executive. The Trump administration has cited non-existent emergencies as reasons for its actions. And with the invocation of the state of emergency, we enter the realm of Carl Schmitt, a most hostile space for democracy. The third reason not to rely on courts to protect democracy rests both on the composition and selection of the judiciary and the relatively autonomous ideology of legal professions as a whole. Legal education is a professional socialization that teaches a conservative view of the role of the judiciary. It is not the role of the judge to create law, but to find and apply law to concrete fact situations proved by the litigants. Moreover, the cost and opportunity cost of legal education select for social groupings with more conservative political views, albeit with a higher level of respect for predictability and procedural regularity and fairness than exists among demagogic politicians. American observers of the trajectory of the Trump regime increasingly draw from German precedents to analyze and warn about challenging its actions in court. In addition to Schmitt's theory of the state of emergency, Ernst Frankel's account of the dual state draws interest. Frankel's account warns us that the normative state, one in which procedural norms, especially in private law, can continue, even alongside the prerogative state in which norms dissolve altogether, is an entirely possible outcome. Now, it's better to have due process overseen by a formally independent judiciary than not to have it at all. But protection of democracy depends on substantive notions of freedom and justice, which are one in the realm of politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken, and to all of our speakers. I come to this topic from my perspective here at the American Historical Association, as well as both an academic and a public historian. I've worked in institutions ranging from the university to now the AHA, which was founded in 1884 and was actually chartered by the United States Congress in 1889 for the promotion of historical studies in the US. But prior to coming to the AHA, I worked at another kind of institution. I worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And from my office window, I would see the lines of school groups waiting to enter the museum. And especially eighth graders who were there to learn about the American past, but also families from across the United States and around the world. And it's history museums, like those that are in part of the Smithsonian, that play a critical role in sustaining democracy. This is other kind of institution. And it's sustaining a democracy, particularly in terms of providing people with access to the full history of their nation, to the full history of their communities, and ultimately of themselves. And in fact, we know that the public places a very high level of trust in museums' portrayals of the past. In 2021, the American Historical Association, with the support of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, supported, we did a survey called History, the Past, and Public Culture. And it corroborated other research that details the public's engagement with history. And in the AHA survey, we found that museums and historic sites were the most trusted sources for accurate accounts of history. They outranked documentary films, they outranked college professors, they outranked nonfiction books, and high school teachers. So the question was why? Well, in part, it's because of the historic artifacts that are on display in those museums. Artifacts that are, of course, interpreted by historians and curators. People connect with history at museums often through physical artifacts and to a considerable extent because of the artifacts. Our survey suggested that there's a striking level of faith and engagement with the apparent authenticity of the physical thing. This idea that it witnessed the past in a way that a historian did not. We noted in that report that objects in museums are perceived as not only representing history, but being history. And they're assumed to be unbiased links to the past, which as historians, we know none of our sources are unbiased. But mobilizing that faith in objects is critical to how people understand connections between past and present. Those historic artifacts are a link to the past, but it's only by researching and interpreting them within this much broader body of historical sources that we gain a more complete understanding of the past. And it's through museums that we can connect with the public in particular. And the public and we ourselves need access to that broad understanding of the past. We need the successes to understand the shortcomings and even the utter failures of our past. We have to understand the really unvarnished history if we're going to understand what democracy is, what it has been, what it may be, and to understand it so that we can value it. And if we're to understand our role in preserving and in realizing the ideals upon which it was created. So many different kinds of institutions that we're talking about here today. I want to throw in the museum, but we're also talking universities and courts and a wide range of institutions with which we engage on a daily basis in our lives. So I want to open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you could raise your hand, and we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and come on camera. We'll proceed from there. But to get us started, we'll start off, as you think of your question, we'll start off with a question from Andrew Mayer in the chat. For the panel, you have seen in your countries and areas of specialty the battle for democratic values and democracy through history. How do you rate the first 100 days of the U.S. Trump second administration in terms of the fight to retain democratic elements, in terms of free speech respect for the courts, and the U.S. Constitution? And further, what strategies would you suggest to fight back against current authoritarian tendencies of this administration? Anyone like to tackle that question? Martina.
Well, I skipped the first question for the moment, but the second question, what strategies, to fight back? And I'm speaking for Germany here because I think that a lot of Germans still think it doesn't touch them in a sense. And I think we still think too strongly at universities that we can simply defend the space we have to say whatever we want to say. And I see that much more critically. And I see that in many universities, and this ties in with what Adam told us about sort of the Nazification of societies from below. We're not at that point, but the attacks of the AfD, they attack anything that smacks of diversity, whatever it might be. And I've seen many, many universities cutting voluntarily their studies on gender studies, on race, etc. And this is not only happening in Germany, and this is happening within the academic bubble and within my own institution, that people are only too happy to let gender studies go, to let gender history go, not to talk about race anymore. So we can see these processes without having a government yet enforcing it. And so I think this is our task to to render people sensible for the danger that's there also in Germany.
Adam.
Yeah, I just want to, say briefly, I don't think that the 100 days is a meaningful unit of analysis. And I think it's a distracting, sort of arbitrary thing that the press likes to brew up as a way to anomalize the Trump movement. And I think it's utterly essential for us as academics not to treat it as an anomaly. And so the question, and I rely here on the really brilliant work of the constitutional scholar Aziz Rana, who shows, I think, quite persuasively that what we're dealing with in the Trump movement isn't the break with constitutional norms, but simply the actualization of the non-democratic tendencies, or the how do I want to put it, the non-democratic tendencies that were built into the constitutional system from the very beginning, right? So we're not this phenomenon, and I also tried to hesitate from using the name of the leader of this movement, because it is a movement and it's been there for not only just decades, but it's the actualization of the white supremacist tendencies upon which the nation is built on, period, right? And yeah, so that's just my intervention.
Ken.
If I could speak to that too. To build on Martina's point, the universities in the United States are having this discussion right now. How long can we defend what we have? And it's subject to multi-levels of attacks. I'm on the faculty senate at Case Western Reserve University, and we're making plans for an austerity budget next year because of cuts to the National Institutes for Health, cuts to National Science Foundation grants, because the indirect cost recovery rate is an integral part of our expected revenues. So irrespective of the number of students we have, and we do have substantial numbers of international students, and it's not a particularly attractive thing to do to come to the United States these days, we're having to face this at the federal level immediately. And there is some tension between our president and the faculty. The president's strategy is to try to keep his head low, think that the administration will exhaust itself, tilting with Harvard and Yale and Penn and Columbia, whereas the faculty think it's just a matter of time. They're going to come for us in our turn. Second, there is the state legislative level. Ohio has passed a terribly repressive bill aimed at applying to public universities. By its terms, it doesn't yet apply to private universities, but it's being slipped into the budget that it would attack a modest state-level scholarship program, which does bring some money to my university, which the president might be reluctant to let go. But if we want to keep that flowing, we'll have to accept all of the interference with academic freedom that's being imposed on the public universities. So it is perfectly clear that universities as institutions can't hold this at arm's length. We have to engage in whatever politics we can on multiple manifold levels to try to resist it in the immediate future.
Anthony.
Hi. I think my question just comes down to democracy and how big of a role all of these things we are saying are bad things that are moving towards fascism. But the question remains, what if that is the wish of the people? I think, if they are aware of the consequences of the actions of as one of the speakers was just saying, the removal of diversification, the removal of gender studies, the removal of race studies, all of these things, as academics, as people in the ivory tower, we would say, yes, it's needed. It's important to have diverse aspects. But what if the democracy itself, what if the people themselves have decided that they want that removed? How is it, why is it our place to tell them they're wrong?
If I could speak to that, in my first draft of my comment, which was obviously much too long, I commented not only that the AHA sued in the United States last Thursday, but the AfD sued in the Verwaltungsgericht in Cologne yesterday. From both sides, there is a resort to the courts in an effort to vindicate their own sense of, each side's sense of what democracy is. For a number of years, really since the first Trump administration, particularly since the violence at the demonstration in Charlottesville in 2017, I have commented on the different limits between Germany and the United States on legitimate political discourse. I do believe that there are a lot of procedural guarantees shrouded around the German proceeding to ban a political party. That's why its success has been so rare. And there have been more examples of failure in efforts to ban parties than there have been successes. That's something that's unheard of in the United States, and it's leading right now to the interference by American political figures in the internal politics of Germany through their overt support for the AfD. Ultimately, if there is a true majority in favor of these policies, I think that it's anti-democratic to prevent it. But the problem is what you have in Germany and what you had in Germany in 1933 and what you have in the United States today is not a true majority. It is mobilized plurality. Republican majorities are chimerical in the United States because of gerrymandering and a whole variety of structures. The AfD, even as it has grown, might in fact become a plurality party, but there has not been a majority party in Germany for most of the federal republic. What's the definition of democracy?
Christina, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I would like to maybe refer back to Adam's input and combine it with Ken's insights on the question of reading this moment alongside the Nazification of German universities, Adam, I want to probe a little bit even the critical premises that you put and the caveats you put into your argument in asking who would be, in comparison, the ones that are now being purged. Well, how do you see this moment in terms of getting rid of particular groups of people from the academia? How far are we there, and how far is this something that can be read alongside what was happening in Nazi Germany? Also in terms of the universities being a place where National Socialism was being produced and expanded as a project, it seems to me that at this point, MAGAism has been produced with the help of academically educated people, for sure, but mostly outside academic and außer university. You know, the German term would be außeruniversitäre Forschungseinrichtungen, or think tanks in which these ideas and projects have been produced. So there seems to be a structural difference also in terms of the democratic energy that is actually in the universities in the United States at this moment, and in Germany, I would argue. So couldn't we be optimistic and say the universities today are actually one of the primary places of the defense of democracy, if we compare it directly to history? So what would that mean for what we have to do as members of the universities? And Ken referred to politics several times as the crucial area of where decisions are being made. What about parliament? And I'm again raising the question, as I had in one of the earlier meetings. I know that the university presidents and people who have influence in the university, they rally and they lobby whoever they can in Congress. What should we bring to light and know about these processes? Because those, I agree, as long as the system works more or less effectively, Congress is the place, because I agree with your analysis of the courts, and they are undemocratically constituted, so they cannot be the defenders of democracy. Ultimately, I agree for that reason. So Parliament would be the place. So how is the relationship? How should we think about the relationship between universities, we as members of universities, and our parliamentarians? What do you see there as what is at stake at the moment, and what should be done in that regard?
Yeah, perhaps I'll start. Thank you, Tina, for the rich series of questions. There's absolutely no doubt there's nothing comparable happening to what occurs on April 7, 1933, when the Nazis passed a law for the restoration of the professional civil service, right, which leads to the sort of sweeping, very, very brutal, very swift faculty purges targeting Jewish faculty and politically undesirable faculty. Nothing like that is currently occurring in the US, and it's unlikely given the mechanisms of a decentralized university system, state, private, that it could and would. That doesn't mean that there aren't structures of normalization in place, and structures of normalization combined with decades of austerity, where sort of the urges or the requirements to conform to a certain academic practice and certain sort of normalized academic discourses, right? And I do think that, I think Martina briefly talked about this sort of thing, but if there is something like this happening, it is with regard to this very heavy consequences one faces for violating anti-CRT laws in certain states, or violating the new batch of anti-trans or anti-diversity laws which are crafted in a really smart way, where it's often not directly about issues of free speech, but about issues of, for example, misusing state funds, right? So the comparisons, I think, break down. I think the India 2025, US 2025 comparison is a far more productive one than the Nazi US comparison. And then just to briefly, before I finish up, you're absolutely right. When the Nazis couldn't change universities in the ways they wanted to, they shifted to non-university, extra university, things like the Ahnenerbe Research Foundation, because that was more pliable to the political aims of National Socialism. And this is neoliberalism has always been an academic project with strong bases at universities, places like University of Chicago, but has also flourished in a wide range of think tanks, right? Which are the Heritage Foundation, of course, being one of the most important ones directly affecting policy today. So, I think the think tank university divide is one that is very untenable in the current situation of global knowledge production, right? Unfortunately, it's breaking down, right? So I'll leave it at that, I think.
And with respect to politics, it remains to be seen how effective that this is going to be on the national level. My university president and our vice president of research decided that they could deal with this issue by having a meeting with our senators, both of whom are very, very junior and both of whom are extreme right-wing Republicans. And the president went into that meeting optimistic that because of the university's position as a job creator and an economic engine of our region, they would be amenable. And apparently it was a completely disastrous meeting that they embrace and adopt, as J.D. Vance has, who was our previous senator, extreme hostility toward the university as a place hostile to their politics. That's one politics that I was skeptical of to begin with and has proven to be bad. There is another politics, which is of more general mobilization. A group of professors at Youngstown State University began gathering signatures to repeal Senate Bill 1, this horrible bill to interfere with public universities. They have met the first threshold, and the very conservative Republican Attorney General yesterday certified it as suitable to go forward. They now have until the end of June to collect 650,000 signatures, in which case it'll be on a referendum ballot in November to repeal that act. That is an opportunity to mobilize, and it's an opportunity for all sorts of people who have benefited from university education, who aspire for their children to enjoy university education rather than indoctrination, to act. And we'll see, this will be the test to the earlier question about what is it that the people want. If they can collect 650,000 signatures in the next 7 weeks, that's a remarkable feat in and of itself. And then we'll see what happens with the referendum.
And it's bills like SB 1 in Ohio and that are circulating in other states that are attempting to restrict academic freedom and restrict universities' ability to function and govern themselves, that are among those that the AHA is constantly reviewing. We're writing, we encourage our members to write and make their thoughts known to their legislators, both at the federal and at the state levels. And sometimes one has to measure their successes in increments. And it might mean that there's simply a less bad bill than there was before, and that there are certain things that are removed from it that will perhaps the worst of the things that were included in a bill have been taken out. And it's in that incremental change to these bills, but then also this active participation in democracy that we're able to have effects. Christoph, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I understand the focus of the panel on universities and courts, but I was wondering, especially following the last answers to the panel, what about other institutions where people of all kinds are hurt by the Trump policies? I'm thinking of Social Security. I'm thinking of the public service. I'm thinking of this, I mean, very difficult to label health policy that Kennedy is doing. The reduction of life-saving institutions of control of health and epidemical surveillance. This is touching the experts, it's touching the personnel, it's touching the kind of the role of expertise in modern society, and it will have long-lasting effects. I'm wondering, can one perhaps create alliances, especially, let's say, between the medical faculty and some of the concerned people who were not in the university, but they were specialists in other areas. And also between people who work on the welfare state and what is happening to pensions and social security, to build larger alliances. Is there any hope, or is this a kind of a utopian question?
I could say something to Debarati, please. No, please.
No, I was just saying that if someone wants to answer to the specific context of the question, then please go ahead, but I can say something from the context of India later.
Debarati, please speak to the case of India.
Yeah, so I was just, I think it's very important that you raise the question of expertise here, because after all, since we largely talked about university spaces, higher education today, it's also that the legitimacy of the universities and the higher academia among the public also relies very much on this legitimacy of the question of expertise, which is where the first question I remember was on how we can respond to authoritarian tendencies. So one of those tendencies are fundamentally about dismissiveness of expertise, particularly expertise of higher academia, of particular universities that propagate liberal democratic ideals. So dismissing that expertise and writing. So I will come mostly from like the discipline of history, but it's not happening only in history. Like we know that the evolution has been deleted from textbooks. Certain very important science notions, science people are facing equal problems with their laboratory resources and all of that. Historians, of course, social scientists and historians, of course. But this idea of expertise and the attack on that actually hits very directly to the position of the university in the society, the position of higher academia in the society. And in the question of alliance, I will say, since many of us, the concerned citizens of the country, the concerned people associated with higher academia, they're thinking of many ways of alliance. Like I can just give a small example of a group of historians, including me. We like conducted a 3-year project on writing children's history books outside the domain of school textbooks. These were books that we kind of build a network with school teachers and tried a different kind of network of circulation, and try to see what engaging with the public directly means. As Sarah was saying, that she calls herself as an academic and a public historian. So that these kind of thoughts are now being brought forth.
Well, I am afraid that we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank once again our panel for participating today and sharing their insights with us, and to all of you for attending. I hope that you will come back for the next in our series on which will focus on transatlantic alliances, and that will be held in 2 weeks on May 20th, again at 11 a.m. Eastern. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much.